another news item. It's not, hot off the presses. It's been circulating for a week and a half or so. But we got some start times, got some kickoff times, got some network assignments for the first 4 weeks of the season. Also some mid-season notes as well. So USC's first two games, the cupcakes, let's just call them what they are. They're cupcakes. They're both 4:30 kickoffs in the Coliseum on August 30 and then on September 7. Ethan, I've had this conversation with Tim Prangley. I've had this conversation with other USC fans, but where do you come down in terms of, in early in the season? Do you have a preferred start time for a USC home game, regardless of what time of year? Does that change early in the season compared to the middle of the season compared to late in the season? Let's just go through that one right off the top.
I think, first of all, it could have been worse. It's not perfect. I think I would have liked it a little bit later, more like a 5:30 or a 6 p.m. start time, especially earlier when it's still light outside. But you don't want to be playing during the day in August and September. So at least it's not like a 1 p.m. or a 3 p.m. or something like that. It's it's towards the end of the heat of the afternoon, so it'll be a little unfortunate for the players that have to warm up at 3 p.m., 3:30 p.m. But for the fans, it's not entirely horrible. I mean, if you're tailgating on campus all day, you're going to be in for a hot one, but it's not. The game itself, again, could be worse. And given that it's the cupcake games, it's, not, I don't think, the end of the world that it's at 4:30. And so, yeah, I'm not super annoyed with that one. I think the one that I saw the most kind of uproar about from USC fans was moving the Northwestern game to Friday night. People really kind of always seem to feel insulted when USC is moved from Saturday to Friday. They want to see USC playing in the primetime slot and not being just kind of like a warm-up game for the weekend type of deal. And I think that says more about Northwestern, honestly, than it does about USC. It's not, a knock on USC that USC is playing a Friday night game, but they think that USC should be so box office that we're getting the Saturday night game or the Saturday games regardless of who our opponent is. And I kind of agree with that. And, maybe in a couple years we'll be back there. But yeah, I don't think anything that came out struck me as being particularly awful. The only early game was the away game, which was the Purdue game. I believe it's at 12:30. Let me double check. It's either 12 or 12. Yeah, 12:30. So, and people seemed pretty in support of the TV assignments as well. So not a ton to complain about. Again, if you want to get super nitpicky, maybe moving it back another hour would be great. But again, for a cupcake game, I've sat through worse. I went to a couple of 1 p.m. games and 3 p.m. games in August and September, and those are no fun. So at least, the first hour might be hot, but it's going to cool down for the last couple of quarters. And that's kind of when you want to keep fans in the seats anyways, especially at USC with a lot of the students who have a tendency to come for the party and then leave, when the blowout starts. At least, when halftime rolls around and hopefully USC's already up by 30 points, it'll be a nice night to sit, and that'll hopefully incentivize people to stick around as it cools off.
Would you prefer a 7 p.m. kickoff or just for like late August through mid-September, or is like 5:30, at which you mentioned earlier, your sweet spot?
I think people also tend to get annoyed when it's super late, just because it, is, being in LA at that late at night, people don't love doing that. And I think I personally am more of a fan of the 5:30 just pretty consistently across the board, no matter what time of year it is. But I can understand if people would rather 7 than 4:30. I wouldn't be against that at all. But it's not a big deal in my mind. But I have heard people who are not super big fans of the 7 p.m. start time because it's so late, and especially they have to stay up really late, and if they are trying to go to church the next morning, or for whatever reason have to get up early on Sunday, it's not ideal to be getting back home at 11:30 midnight, even 1 a.m. if they're commuting from somewhere elsewhere in Southern California. So I think in my mind, 5:30 is kind of the ideal, 5:36. But yeah, I can see if somebody said 7 over 4:30, that's definitely not crazy, especially in August and September.
In terms of the other USC schedule notes, there's going to be a road game at Iowa, and they haven't officially announced the start time there, but that's going to be a noon or a 12:30 game, but that's in November. So that's great news for USC, indisputably, because you're not playing the early game, that 11 a.m. Central Time, 9 a.m. Pacific. You're not playing the body clock game, but you're also not going to Kinnick Stadium at night. So USC avoids the two worst case scenarios there, mid-afternoon, early afternoon Pacific, mid-afternoon Central. That is exactly the time slot you want for Iowa in November. As for the Northwestern game, here's a note. That's November 7, all right? The World Series will be over by that time. And we all remember a year ago, USC played Rutgers on a Friday night, and it coincided with Freddie Freeman's grand slam in the bottom of the ninth in game 1 of the World Series. So USC fans had to choose, and there are plenty who were watching the Dodger game on their handheld devices inside the Coliseum. We're obviously following the action. So there's no conflict with the World Series this year for a Friday game. So that's at least a small breadcrumb of relief. The other point I would make, and Ethan, you're right. Like, Alabama does not play Friday night games. Ohio State, Oklahoma, Texas, they do not play Friday night games. So it is kind of an insult, yes. But here's the silver lining, is that USC gets an extra day of rest for the remaining big games on the schedule later in November. So, and because USC is now in the Big Ten, and because the logistics and the travel are bigger deals, getting that extra day of rest could really work to USC's benefit down the line. Let's go back to the Purdue game. So that's a CBS game, early afternoon. The point I have to keep coming back to is, USC flying to the middle of Indiana in September, they're going to have to fly back to South Bend 1 month later. Like people might be annoyed at me for banging that drum, but with that Purdue start time being official, okay, I promise this is the last time I'll talk about that until September 13 or until game week. All right. I won't keep mentioning it through June, July, August, but this is the last time to mention it. Just, if USC is going to the Big Ten, and I know that when you collect a big pile of television money, you're doing what the television networks want you to do. But that said, if you can't at least insist on a few very specific protections, there are a few Big Ten teams that will occasionally play Notre Dame, Purdue being one of them. But if USC was going to say, hey, we want membership, you would think, right, that USC would have been able to pound the table and say, all right, we have this unique thing going with Notre Dame, a thing that the other West Coast schools, UCLA, Washington, Oregon, don't have, a thing that most other Big Ten schools don't have. When we go to Notre Dame, we're playing Purdue or Indiana either the week before or the week after. I just think that when you consider how upset and worried USC is about its larger scheduling picture, this was the 2-foot putt to win the Masters. This was the birdie tap in. This right here, this Purdue thing, Purdue or Indiana, this should have been the most obvious schedule adjustment to make for the Big Ten, and the Big Ten was not there for USC. I'm pretty pissed, Ethan Inman.
Yeah, and now you're kind of having to backtrack and instead try to get Notre Dame to move when they have all of the leverage in the world, and we're kind of talking about how they're winning the PR war in terms of this whole scheduling battle. And I saw another comment recently where Marcus Freeman came out and said, I want to play USC anytime, any place, every year. And it just kind of I was just like, man, like, who knows what's really going on behind the scenes, but they're really sure saying all the right things. They're kind of having the attitude that I want USC to have, where we're not scared of anybody. That's kind of what I think a lot of USC fans want to have. Because, obviously it's the current ecosystem of college football really benefits Notre Dame a lot, but USC is the kind of program historically who hasn't been afraid of anybody. So you want them to kind of step to that rivalry and not be so afraid of it. But anyway, I think, yeah, it's unfortunate that they're having to fight that battle now with Notre Dame and trying to get the Notre Dame game to move when, again, it's tradition. Like, you go to South Bend in October and then they come here at Thanksgiving. Like, that's how it's always been. So even trying to change that is a break of tradition, which is unfortunate. But yeah, it's annoying. It's clearly only because of the television rights. Like, Purdue's not going to be a great football team, and they're probably not going to be competitive against USC for 9 out of 10 years that USC is in the Big Ten. Going forward, at least the way it seems both programs are trending and how both programs have done historically. So you are gonna that game's gonna keep getting scheduled in September. And if the Notre Dame rivalry continues, it's never going to align with it. And some years it'll be better than others because you'll get, the Purdue game at home, and then you'll get but then both games are at home, and then it doesn't matter. So I don't know. They should have figured it out. And I just hope now they can, even though they chose the more difficult path, obviously, by trying to figure it out with Notre Dame, that they can work something out, because you don't want I've always said that the whole, oh no, we have to go to Indiana twice is like an annoying excuse. And so I hope that, if that ends up being the excuse for ending this historic 100+ year rivalry, and it's a genuine excuse in some senses, but again, like you said, it's something they could have handled from the beginning. So if that ends up being the reason, that'll be really unfortunate, and it'll break a lot of USC fans' hearts and a lot of Notre Dame fans' hearts as well, who have just watched this rivalry for decades and have loved kind of the annual tradition of keeping it up. So be a really weak excuse, and I hope that doesn't happen.
Yeah, one thing that has to be said, and like, obviously Marcus Freeman is able to say, because his team made the national championship game, Notre Dame's an ascendant program right now. Like, Marcus Freeman is in a position where he can kind of puff his chest and say, well, we'll play USC anytime. And so, to a certain extent, Notre Dame has the high ground, because Notre Dame's not trying to back out of this series. We can admit that. But let's also apply some sanity here in terms of, let's not say that Notre Dame is just like the most upstanding, morally correct, virtuous program. Notre Dame gets to carve out its own schedule. Notre Dame, by being independent, which, by the way, like, if I'm thinking about this from a Notre Dame perspective, of course I'm staying independent. Why would I join a conference? I get all the revenue. I don't have to share it with anybody. So, like, it makes sense for Notre Dame. It's smart for Notre Dame. I'm not knocking Notre Dame's decision, but I'm just saying it is easy for Notre Dame to say, well, we'll play USC anytime, anywhere. Like, we'll take on all challenges, when, by virtue of not being in a conference, you can arrange your schedule in a very particular way. That's something Notre Dame has that no other prominent school. BYU was an independent for a little bit, but really Notre Dame has always been in its own unique category in terms of being able to create its own schedule. So I'm not saying Marcus Freeman's a hypocrite. I'm just saying it's very easy for him to take the high ground. There's nothing bad with taking the high ground, but it's very easy and convenient for him to do that. Like, there's no downside, there's no risk for Marcus Freeman to say what he said. USC is undeniably in a much more difficult position made tougher by dumb BS, such as having to fly to West Lafayette to play Purdue in September, and then 5 weeks later you have to fly back to South Bend, the middle of Indiana. Notre Dame does not have that problem, so it should definitely be mentioned in terms of the larger scheme of things. All right, so even since we're talking about times and schedules, some games early in the season have been released in terms of the particular TV assignments. One of the big stories in the Big Ten, it's not a USC story, but Ohio State playing Texas in week 1 on Fox Big Noon Saturday, and I get the obvious point that you don't have a full day of tailgating if you're an Ohio State fan. The game's at noon. Like, you can't really have a lunch tailgate. It's basically a breakfast tailgate. You can't get a few extra beers in the system. You can't chat for a few extra hours with your buddies. You're just going into the stadium right after noon. So I get that, but you're making gobs of money from your television arrangement from the Big Ten, and Fox Big Noon gets huge ratings. Like, it gives your program a platform. Should Ohio State fans and any other Big Ten fans upset at the Fox Big Noon slot? Like, are they just carrying this gripe too far, or should they really be as offended as I sense they are?
Well, I've kind of always been an early riser myself, Matt, but I always think that the kind of morning/afternoon, game hate is a little overblown, unless, you're playing in a place like LA where you're playing when it's super duper hot outside and it's like August or September, then I get it. But, in terms of, I don't know, breakfast tailgates are fun. I think the best food that I've ever had at a tailgate was this past season. I had a couple of early tailgates because USC had a couple of early games. I think it was the Wisconsin game and then also the Nebraska game. Both times I had breakfast burritos, and hands down, best tailgate food I've ever had. If you haven't ever had a breakfast burrito tailgate, make sure that you do it this season. You might have to do it for the Purdue game, which is not a home game, and you might have to make it at your house before you turn on CBS and probably yell at the screen because a lot of people don't like the CBS coverage. But I think people kind of gripe a little bit too much, and I get the drinking argument. Nobody wants to, if that's what your excuse to drink is watching college football, you don't want to wake up at 6 a.m. to start putting beers in your system or whatever. But if you're an Ohio State fan or a Texas fan, you're probably overly confident that your team's going to win anyway, so you can plan your drinking for after your team wins. Obviously, that's not going to happen for both, but knowing Ohio State fans and knowing Longhorn fans, they're probably both feeling like 100% it's going to happen. So you can just plan it for after, or you can drink because your team lost and you're trying to drown your sorrows, whatever. But just make some breakfast burritos and look at the bright side. And, maybe that I guarantee that after you have a couple of breakfast burritos in your system, you'll feel a lot better about your team having Big Noon kickoff.
One of the interesting points that I make, because I think the anger is overblown. Now I do think that Ohio State and other Big Ten fans have a point where, all right, like, we can't be on Big Noon like 4 or 5 times. That part I get. Like, it should be a little bit more of a mixed profile. You should get some 3:30 Eastern slots as well as some of the primetime slots. That point I get. Like, there should be a bit of balance, and it is a little bit imbalanced. Like, that to me is the argument I like from the Ohio State fan base, from the Ohio State point of view. But on a more specific individual level, like having a big game, a huge game in the early noon window, noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific window, like, isn't that supposed to be part of what makes college football great?
Yep.
Like you get this huge game. First off, you're not waiting all day for it, and like, you already have your electric moment. And the other thing is, like, most noon Eastern games aren't great. So to have one really big game, it anchors that window, because you know there are always going to be multiple 3:30 games of significance. There are always going to be multiple 7:30, 8 p.m. Eastern games of significance. You know that there are going to be several really good college football games competing against each other in those mid-afternoon and primetime windows. So it's good to get a big game early. You don't want all of the product to be at night, and frankly, you can't have all of the product in prime time. like the NFL, like the Fox America's Game of the Week, the 425, either the NFC East or the 49ers, Chiefs, Bills, whatever, the biggest teams in the NFL. Like the big NFL game is the 425 game, also the Sunday night football game. But college football distinguishes itself from the NFL by having a huge game at noon. That makes college football different, and you get big game number 1, big game number 2 at 3:30, big game number 3 in prime time. So I get Ohio State fans not wanting like 4 or 5 big noons. I sympathize with Ohio State fans there, but like the really big king size games being at noon, like Texas Oklahoma has been a noon game a large percentage of the time over the past 15, 20 years. I don't seem to recall Texas or Oklahoma fans having a really hard time with that. Now, I know Oklahoma fans like playing more night games than 11 a.m. games in general, but the Texas game being early hasn't seemed to be a problem. So, Ethan, like in terms of your college football tastes and preferences, I would have to think that, and you said you're an early riser, like it's good to have big games in each of the day's time windows, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you said it's kind of part of what distinguishes college football from the NFL, and I think that that's absolutely right. I have always felt like college football is a more like spend your entire day watching games. It's more suited for that than the NFL. Maybe that's just, my upbringing and the TV providers that I've had, but I feel like with kind of all the blackout rules that the NFL has and, just the way that national TV scheduling has worked over the years, I might not always have a game to watch at 10 and at 1 and at, I've been on the West Coast, so that's why I'm saying 10 and 1 and 5:30, but, if it's 1 and 4 and 8:30 on the East Coast, whatever, it's the same difference. Whereas with college football, like there's always something nationally televised on all the time just because there's so many games going on. So there's never a dull moment on a Saturday. And kind of like you said, like right when you wake up, that's when you're the most excited. I wake up and I'm like, oh, it's Saturday. It's, I've just had a long week of whatever, school, work, and now I can just kind of decompress and watch college football. And the game that I'm naturally going to be most excited about is the first one that I can put on. If it's, Nebraska, Iowa, and both teams are, have about as many wins as they do losses on the season, it's going to get a lot more of my excitement than if that game was at 1 o'clock or 4 o'clock on the East Coast, then I might not turn it on because there's probably a better game on than that one. But if it's the game at 9 a.m., then it's the first college football game I can watch. So it's going to get more of my excitement than that a game of that caliber normally would. So yeah, for a big game, I think it only benefits you, gets even more excitement. And yeah, people are so down on mornings, and I get that you want to sleep in a little bit after the work week, and I get that you want to have a bit more of a ramp up for your tailgating and all of that stuff. But especially if it's one Saturday out of your whole year, I get the whole 5 Saturdays argument, a little annoying. But if, it's just one time that you have to go to bed a little bit earlier on Friday night, have breakfast burritos instead of burgers and hot dogs, and, but again, you get to wake up and know that in a couple of hours you get to watch Ohio State take on Texas. Like, there's nothing better than that feeling, I don't think, in my mind. Like you said, you don't have to wait around all day and, watch a couple of bad games on TV, and you just get you go to bed on Friday night and wake up on Saturday morning excited because the next thing that you're doing is going to see your favorite team play college football. So yeah, I mean, I think just look at the bright side, look at some of those benefits, and again, if you get scheduled for 5 games, then I can see you can start to complain, but just look at the bright side and have some fun with it. And you can complain to the TV networks a little bit for being greedy and all that kind of stuff. I get that, but we don't have to. You're just ruining it for yourself if you're always caught up in what the TV networks are doing and how that's negatively affecting you. Just try to turn it around and have a great time, and I think that you can. There's a lot of things you can do with a morning game.
We had a little Monty Python here on the Voice of College Football. Always look on the bright side of life. Ethan Inman dropping that turn of phrase a few times. All right, Ethan, a simple question. Now, you can just think about the answer while I kind of go off on a little digression here. But Ethan, the question is, what's your biggest gripe with college football scheduling? So I'm going to offer a little bit of context before I bring you in for the answer. One thing that has struck me, and hey, I'm going to date myself here, but I've been watching college football since 1981. The 1981 Gator Bowl, North Carolina, Arkansas. That's the first college football game I ever remember watching. So I've been watching this sport for over 4 decades, all right? The thing that always kills me, Ethan, and everyone watching here at the Voice of College Football is, as much as college football has been different from the NFL, especially with the noon Eastern games that we've just talked about. As much as college football is and has been different from the NFL, it's the same as the NFL in this regard. Standardized game windows: noon, 3:30, 7:38. Like just the consistent blocks across the day. And then also the 10:30 Eastern game, if you want to carry that through, the late night window. It's such a mystery to me, Ethan. And I mean, people will say TV contracts, but hey, TV contracts can always be reworked. They can always be renegotiated between and among parties. It's always struck me as just the most unusual thing that we don't have a regular 1:30 Eastern game window each week. We don't have a regular 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific game window. And we don't have a regular 9:30 Eastern, 6:30 Pacific game window. And I say that for reasons that I think you, Ethan, and the audience can readily grasp. Is that, let's say Fox comes in with big noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. Why isn't ESPN or ESPNU, ESPN2, like ESPN and ABC, Disney, they have all these channels. Why don't we have a regular 1:30 game that's right between big noon and 3:30? Because that way you have staggered starts, so you're not trying to catch the end of every game at the end of the 3 standardized windows. And you're not having 4 or 5 really important games all going down to the wire at the same time. If you have 3 or 4 1:30 Eastern games and 3 or 4 5 Eastern games and 3 or 4 9 or 9:30 Eastern games, you have these staggers. It's like the Sweet 16 in college basketball in the NCAA tournament. Why just have these games start a half hour apart? And if the game that starts a half hour, the regional semifinal that starts a half hour later, goes really quickly or rather goes very slowly, you can have the 2 games, regional semifinal games, ending pretty much at the same time. Why not do like a 1-hour stagger so that you're guaranteed to be able to watch the second half of one game, and then you watch the end of that game, and then when that game is done, then you're at halftime of the other game and you can watch the second half of that one. So it carries over to college football, that you get to watch the full big noon game, and then you're going to be at halftime of a 1:30, maybe a 2 Eastern window, but you get the point. 1:30, 2 o'clock, pretty much in the middle between noon and 3:30. Like that's the thing that just absolutely slays me about college football scheduling. So I've said my part. Ethan, your biggest gripe about college football scheduling as you have personally experienced it.
I think you make a really good point, and I think your point about college basketball is a really good one, because that is one of the great things about March Madness is like starting at 9 a.m. and basically all day there's just a game starting like every 30 minutes to an hour. So if you wanted to watch March Madness all day and just kind of check off the games on your bracket or whatever you do with March Madness, like you have a full day to do it and there's no breaks, and you can have a game on pretty constantly in the background of whatever you're doing or whatever. So yeah, I totally get that point, and I agree with you there. I think for me, I would love to see a little bit more of just college football trying to establish itself a little bit in a little bit of a traditional scheduling. I think that's something that the NFL has done really well in recent years, is make their one game that's on Thursday night or on Monday night, or even sometimes on Saturdays and towards the end of the season after college football is over, they make those like actually desirable games to watch. And I think the reason why for USC it's an insult to play on Friday night, it's because historically college football just puts kind of the nothing games on Friday nights or Thursday nights or whatever, just because it's people want to watch college football, they'll be watching anyway, or otherwise they'll be going to a high school game or whatever, because high school is for Friday and college is for Saturday and the NFL is for Sunday. And so I'm not saying like take the college schedule and start spreading it out evenly over the week. That's not what I'm saying at all. But if you just started maybe putting one or two bigger games on at times or on days that were a little bit differently than normal. It doesn't have to be the biggest game. It doesn't have to be Ohio State, Texas, but just start making college football a little bit more readily available at kind of a larger diversity of times. I think that it would start to kind of get rid of the stigma that like if you're not at 3:30 on Saturday, that means that the college football world doesn't care about you. And again, it's something that the NFL has done a decent job of doing. I think that they're still working on Thursday night a little bit, but Monday night's a great time to watch an NFL game. And Thursday night has the benefit of just being kind of the start of the football weekend. So I don't know. I think if they can stop making games compete with each other so much, and whether that's doing like you said and spreading it out a little bit more, or just making a little bit more availability for people to watch games at different time slots, I think that only benefits them, because it just makes, who doesn't want more college football? If there's 3 games at 3:30, then you can't watch all 3 games. But if there's a game at 3:30 and a game, one of the great things about the Hawaii football program is their games are always so late. So if people want to stay up really late and watch college football, like it's not an ideal time to watch college football by any means, but people still love it, because if they haven't gotten their fill, there's still one more game that starts at 8 p.m., 9 p.m., whenever it starts. So I don't think that people would respond entirely negatively to a little bit more atypical scheduling. But again, nothing crazy, just a little bit more experimentation and a little bit more of fleshing that out to be something that's actually a good thing and actually gets more eyes on your game and is not an insult. They can figure out how to work that. I think that'd be good for the game.
Ethan, I have a deep nostalgic ache, a very deep longing for that Hawaii game on the first Saturday of December, last Saturday of November. At the end of the season, you get that high profile. It was often a high profile game. A team that a power conference team that's concluded its regular conference schedule, but they go to Hawaii for what was like a 13th. It was an added game. They request a waiver from the NCAA to play that extra game in early December, and ESPN used to carry Hawaii games. Sadly that doesn't happen nowadays. But just you get that one last game, and it's from the islands late at night while it's in December, cold in most of the country. Not so much in LA, of course, for the USC fan base, but still, like that, there's a very special place in my heart for that late Hawaii